The Shadows over Garenport campaign is my sample campaign for Dark Fantasy X. I'm also working on a second sample campaign, Cult of Undeath, which originally started as a completely different project, and then I have a third identified campaign, Mind Wizards of the Demon Wastes. And I have some other campaigns that will be inserted in between those, both full-size, at least one full-size campaign, and at least one mini campaign that's a little bit smaller. So let me explain super quickly again how I do this. I believe in the narrow, wide, narrow approach, whereas I start a campaign in a somewhat railroady fashion because my players don't know their characters yet, they don't know the setting yet, they're just not ready to grab the reins and run with it. So the stuff that I've already reviewed so far, the Demon Spice of the Barrow Downs, is kind of the narrow portion, and it's somewhat railroady, not entirely, but the premise is kind of, you have to buy into the fact that you're doing this premise. The Shadows over Garenport is more open, and it will then eventually kind of come to a conclusion at the end where it'll be narrow again, and I funnel all of the potential threads of things that the PCs could be working on into a satisfying conclusion. So I tend to divide this into 5 fronts. Each one is a kind of a column, and each one has 5 steps in it, so it's a 5x5 matrix. And this post today is going to be on the first column. I originally actually named it after the whole campaign, and it was the one that the campaign was based on. I've now given it a different name, Chaos in the North, and it does, of course, mostly feature problems in Garenport, hence the name. And I'm going to have a few spoilers here. The Grand Duchess of Garenport is a witch. This isn't just a rumor. This is what's going to happen. Well, let me take a step back first. After the players play through the whole Master of the Pack business with the Devil Spice and all that, they will have got the attention of the people who are looking for talented freelancers that can kind of serve as, they can kind of have a roving commission, if you will, and serve as kind of like the boys from Supernatural, Dean and Sam Winchester, or kind of like the X-Files, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, except, of course, you're in a fantasy setting. So this guy, they'll have a few patrons who will approach them with problems that they want stuff looked at, and one of them will be the Grand Duchess up in Garenport, up in Northumbria, is a witch, and she's been locked in her tower by her husband, who doesn't have the either the wherewithal or the heart to kill her, as he should, because she's a witch. Anyway, this is all a bunch of rumors. He's like, I don't know for sure what's going on, but as you're kind of working around doing stuff, can you try to check it out? We're going to have some other agents who will probably be heading up that way as well. I'm very cautious, however, not to make this sound super urgent, because I don't want them to ignore other things that are going on as they're working on this, and I want all 5 of the columns in this 5x5 matrix to kind of intertwine in terms of at least in terms of actual play. They won't be doing one after the other, but they'll instead kind of be working on different steps of them all throughout. So the first spoiler, the Grand Duchess, like I said, really is a witch. This isn't just a rumor. In fact, she's a real basically a supernatural, life-sucking Elizabeth Bathory type, except instead of just justification for being a psycho serial killer, it actually works. She's taking young girls, killing them, bathing in their blood, and it's preserving her youth and beauty or whatever. The confinement in the tower isn't what it seems. She actually has sorceress means of coming and going as she pleases, although she rarely does, because she also has sorceress means of communicating with her minions without leaving. In reality, the Grand Duke didn't imprison her at all. She entered the tower and fortified it with thaumaturgy and magic against him and his own pet sorcerers. It's more like her panic room, not her prison, But he spun the story differently for the people, of course. His advisors also suspect that she may be a lich with canopic talisman, or with a canopic talisman, which in my setting is kind of like the phylactery in D&D, or like the Horcrux in Harry Potter, or whatever. I call it canopic talismans in Dark Fantasy X. And that will bring her back from the dead like Koschei the Deathless, until it's destroyed, of course, and then she can be killed for real. But the Grand Duke isn't any better. In fact, although he's not really a lich because he has no sorceress talents, his own sorceress advisors have created for him a canopic talisman, so he is also like Koschei the Deathless. Not only that, he wants to militarily conquer Southumbria and turn the entire freedom-loving hill country into his own private domain, the Hill Kingdom, with himself as its first reigning king, of course. He's been kidnapping poor or foreign girls for the Grand Duchess's bloodbath for some time. In fact, he'd started in particular kidnapping Southumbrian girls in the hope of raising a hue and cry for him to save the Southumbrians from the terror of their missing daughters. That didn't go on for very long, however, before he had to move against his wife because she was about to move against him. Both of them have as their primary goal to destroy the other and end their deathless states so that they can rule undisputed and unchallenged by the other. The Grand Duke does have a canopic talisman locked in his own secret chambers in a place nobody else knows, or so he believes. The Grand Duchess does not have a canopic talisman and is not actually a lich. She's just maintained her youth via renewal by killing and torturing various young girls and stealing their vitality. But the Grand Duke doesn't know that, so he's on a quest to find her talisman, which does not exist. She also has discreet agents searching for clues to the whereabouts of the Grand Duke's own talisman, as well as how to get rid of his two sorceress advisors, one a wizened old warlock of frightful reputation, and the other a vampire from Timishburg. She would have some agents looking in Burham's Landing, or she would have some agents located in Burham's Landing looking for discreet and capable people that could be talked into trying to assist in this task, which naturally the PCs will be prime candidates for, as they will kind of obligatorily, by means of geography, have to pass through Burham's Landing to get from Barrowmere to Garenport. Meanwhile, the second row of the column is that as the PCs approach Garenport, they will find the countryside in a state of turmoil. The Ladies' Guard, her own personal bodyguard, and personal small military unit was disbanded and declared outlaw, but their oaths to the Grand Duchess mean that they are living outside of town, attempting to find a way to overthrow the regime that has imprisoned their patroness. However, they don't really have a solid plan or the manpower to execute their grander ideas, so they're mostly just accosting travel into and out of the city and the villages and hamlets of the Garenport Peninsula. They also have no means of supporting themselves very well except via banditry. This has had little impact on progress towards their goals and has angered the common people who live outside the city. I suppose it's possible that the PCs may want to help them get their act together and stand against the Grand Duke, especially if they fall really hard for the story that Josephine's agents will tell of his wickedness, which is the added benefit of being true, even though it leaves out the fact that she's every bit his match. Or they may want to stop them from harassing regular people in the countryside. Or they may want to avoid them, but they'll have to deal with them in some way because the Grand Duke has laid false trails for anyone searching for his canopic talisman that it's hidden in the hut of a witch or warlock deep in the wilderness. It isn't, but there really are witches and warlocks deep in the wilderness, as well as other unsavory things, and the Ladies' Guard is on their way to becoming one of the more unsavory things themselves, even if many of them are well-intentioned, albeit desperate. The third row of the column is the City Watch, which has become a Stalin-esque secret police as they beat down the doors of anyone they suspect might know anything at all about Josephine's canopic talisman. Because it doesn't exist, they're getting more desperate and more aggressive in their tactics. Many of the Duke's people, including many who run the City Watch, are using the excuse to finger rivals or enemies as having information, even if it's just invented. Many of them simply disappear, never to be seen again. In reality, the Duke's vampire runs the City Watch as his own personal military in the Duke's name, and not only do the abuses of the Watchmen themselves need to be stopped, because they are throttling the freedom and livelihood, not to mention the actual lives in some cases of the citizenry, but the vampire, Lucien Russo, is using the opportunity to take victims. Some of them are now enthralled ghouls or lesser vampires, but most are just vampire food. I'm not sure if he's happy just empire building as a subordinate to the Grand Duke, or if he hopes to supplant him, but I suppose it doesn't really matter, as his problems will come to the fore long before he makes a move on the Grand Duke, if he ever wants to. That said, as part of this, the PCs and the Duke's Inquisition will get wind of a carefully planted red herring on learning that the Grand Duchess's personal huntsman left on a ship for Kayminster, and from there by coach to Burlharrow, an isolated town in the far north. In truth, the huntsman, named Morkant Gunderic, doesn't know anything about any talisman of the Duchess's, because he believes that she doesn't have one. But he does know that the Duke's castle is riddled with secret passages, and that he once saw the Duke putting something in a safe in a secret cobwebbed chamber with no windows, accessible only through the secret passages. The Duke never saw him, and he never told anyone about it until now. Plus, this will allow the PCs to interact with two other columns, the Ratman Plague in Burlharrow, and the Orkling Pirates on the Darkling Sea. 3 birds, 1 stone. We'll get to those two later in a different video. The 4th row of the column will be the several other practitioners of witchcraft who are getting careless in the chaotic environment. Some are seen by the populace in lynchings and worse of the guilty, and occasionally of the only suspicious or unlikable, start to become semi-regular occurrences in Garenport, as well as riots, as the Grand Duke isn't addressing them to the populace's satisfaction. In reality, these other practitioners are often freelancers, but some are minions of either the Duke or the Duchess as well, and as the PCs get involved with them in one way or another, they can start to get clues and hints that will allow them to piece together the true story of the corruption in Garenport. The Rangers, in particular, a few operating Shadow Rangers, are here too, and have had to, much to their distaste, make some temporary accommodations with some of the freelancer witchcraft practitioners to bring about the greater good. Plus, they provide a slightly more trustworthy source of information if needed. Their long-term goals are to bring down the Duchess and her reign of murderous terror, and to make sure that both the vampire Lucien Russo and the sorceress Seneschal Grigori Nicholas are taken down. If they are aware of the Grand Duke's Koschei-like state, he'd be a target too. Of course, that's barely a step down from regicide, because Northumbria has no king, but it's way too political for the Rangers' taste. There will be some hard conversations and decisions to be made along this row. The 5th and final row hinges on the Grand Duchess in a ploy born of frustration, impatience, or desperation, or maybe even on accident. She summons some kind of demonic entity to end those who she's buttressed her defenses against, namely the vampire, the Seneschal, and the Grand Duke himself. This obviously will go wildly wrong, and a demonic entity will run amok through Garenport until the PCs can put it down. How all this ends is TBD. What will the PCs do about the Grand Duke, his wife, his corrupt court, the City Watch, the Ladies' Guard, both of which have turned into secret police, gangsters, organized criminals, or worse? I don't know. You'll have to ask them. But I've got all this stuff set up about what the villains will actually do, and that's how I run. The details of how they accomplish these goals can't be established until I get a handle on the PCs and what they're doing. And even then, details is used somewhat flippantly. I don't believe in detailed planning. I believe in planning the villains' moves and making sure that the PCs are aware enough of them that they can make plans of their own on what they're going to do about it. And if the PCs don't actually care as much about these problems and don't seem to address them, well, things will start going wrong, of course, because they're not being addressed. But in the meantime, I've got 4 other columns that they can be dealing with as well. So there's plenty of things for them to do, even if they don't take a super keen or urgent interest in any of these problems. Anyway, that's the first column. Next time I come back into this playlist, I'll address the second column, which is the Tzita death cults. And it is a completely different type of column. As I said before, I kind of like to have 2 axes. One of them is a sneaky kind of black ops versus brute force, and then the other one is supernatural versus natural. The Duke, the Grand Duchess, the Grand Duke, the Grand Duchess, and all of their maneuvering is, of course, more of a kind of sneaky political type of front, and it also obviously has strong supernatural elements to it. The Tzita death cults will be kind of the opposite on both of those fronts, mostly. So we'll get back to that when I come back next time. In the meantime, hope this is useful. Thanks.